Picture, if you will, a house at the far edge of a wood. Within it, a library that remembers the world. As you settle where you are, let that thought rest like a warm stone beneath your palm. Breathe in as if you are drawing in the hush of a room where lamps burn low. Breathe out as if you are turning the first page of a long, patient book. Let the shoulders loosen. Let the jaw soften. There is time for everything here. There is time for a road, for a carriage, for a rose to be asked for, and for the night to listen. If these quiet stories ease your sleep, you might like to follow for more. For now, stay with the hush. Imagine a slow road leading away from a town of narrow streets and shuttered windows, a ribbon of dust and chalk that becomes softer as it nears trees. In the hush near the trees, the air carries two things: the faint tang of salt from a distant sea, and the warm, honeyed scent of drying linen. It is along that road that Laurent used to walk with his basket full of small things to sell: patterned cloths, brass trinkets polished to a gentle gleam, glass beads that caught the sun when he found a good customer. Laurent had once been a man of trade and of steady steps. He knew the measure of things. He could tell a buyer's mood by the way their fingers rested on the edge of a bowl. For many years they were not rich, but they were enough. His house had been tidy and upright, a place where the kettle sang promptly and where candles were placed to read by in the long evenings. He had 3 daughters, and the youngest, Camille, moved about the house with the kind of calm that made small storms still themselves. She was the sort of person who could mend a tear in a sleeve without fuss, who could coax a stubborn seed into the ground and wait patiently for green to show. She loved work that was honest and useful. She loved the small order of things. Things changed, as they will. A season of misfortunes began as quietly as a moth entering a room. A ship that carried much of Laurent's goods did not return. Debts came like rain. At first 1 or 2 drops, then a steady leak down the corners of the household. Chairs were sold. The brass went. The glass beads passed into other hands. The house grew thinner by careful degrees. The linen that had once smelled of beeswax and lavender began to take on the sharpness of damp. Laurent's step became less certain. He put on his coat with the same fingers, but when he looked out of the window at dusk, he could not quite believe the sky belonged to him in the way it had. On a day that had neither the clarity of early spring nor the chill of late autumn, Camille asked for something small. She had watched her sisters choose ribbons and finery at different times, their laughter like bright coins. She had asked for nothing of such flutter. Instead, in the quiet kitchen where the fire burned low and a cat slept on wind-swept sunlight, she said only, "A rose, Father. If there is a single rose, that will do." It was the kind of request that held no extravagance, only the memory of a scent and the delicate turning of petals beneath a careful thumb. Laurent, who loved her in the soft, useful way that fathers often do, set out to find that rose. He believed he could procure it with a small coin and a courteous word. But fortune had been unkind, and perhaps something in his gait had shifted. The world that morning felt as if it would close its shutters upon him. There was a storm on the way, though he did not know it yet. A storm that would carry him past hedgerows, past the last welcoming inn, to a gate he had not expected to open. He traveled by cart and then on foot, his coat wrapped about him, the road beginning to slick round the ruts as clouds thickened above. The wind leaned into him like a companion with a sharp elbow, and the trees along the lane whispered with the sort of talk that keeps secrets. When the rain began, it was polite at first, soft as a shiver across a window pane. Then it gained confidence, and the cart's wheels made a low, contented moan as they swallowed mud. That was when the horse, startled at something in the darkened hedgerow, pulled hard. The cart jolted, a wheel scraped, and the path seemed suddenly unfamiliar. By the time Laurent found himself before a tall gate, soaked through and shivering, he had forgotten the map of hedgerows and lanes. The gate stood between two stone pillars, ironwork curling in careful loops, and beyond it rose the silhouette of a house, large and solitary, set back from everything. Roof lines like the back of a great sleeping animal. Vines climbed the walls, and in a break beside the gate a single rose bush stood, its stems bending under the weather, but along it a single bloom still held on. It glowed like the last coin in a purse. He did not intend to trespass. He meant only to shelter for a moment, perhaps to ask for a drink and a place to stand while the storm passed. Yet the house was not empty of eyes. A man emerged from a doorway in the stones, as if the house itself had breathed in and pushed him out. He was tall and grave, his expression set like a carved face. His coat was long, and his movements deliberate. Where another host might have greeted a sodden traveler with indecorous haste, he inclined his head and spoke with a voice that had the slow certainty of someone who measured each word before it fell. There was food on his table by the time Laurent's teeth stopped chattering. A dark broth, bread that had been warmed in embers, a small wedge of cheese wrapped in paper, the sorts of things that make a person feel their bones are again their own. The house felt oddly unhurried. A lamp burned high by the staircase, and there were rugs on the floor that took the chill from the soles of one's feet. And yet there was something else. A hush in the passages, as if the house listened to itself. Over and again Laurent's eyes strayed to the stair that wound southwards, to a door that stood slightly ajar, where a sliver of lamplight revealed a row of carved spines like teeth. When Laurent, perhaps in a moment of thoughtless gratitude, or in the muddling fog of a man who had lived a day too long under worry, took from the doorstep the single rose that rested on the bush, he did not imagine it would matter beyond the joy it might bring to his daughter. He did not know then that an owner of a house such as this might keep a careful account of what passed through its gates. The man who had let him in came upon him in the garden, as the rain slackened to a fine mist. His face, which had been indulgent over the meal, had gained a different light. Not anger, no sudden shout nor dramatic snarl, but a stillness that weighed heavier. He asked Laurent questions with the gentleness of someone reciting carefully prepared lines. He said that the house did not belong to no one, that hospitable acts were not without cost, that everything taken carried with it the need for something to be given in return. You can imagine, perhaps, the rise and fall in Laurent's chest, the apology that folded like a paper bird between them. There were words about mistakes, about need, about ways to make amends. The man, named in the hush of the house as Antoine, offered not punishment but a strict commerce. The rose could be kept, but a debt should be settled. A servant's work, or the sending of a family member. Otherwise, Laurent must remain while he found some other recompense. The choice given was not cruelly wielded, but it had the inevitability of law. It carried a quiet dignity. When Laurent returned home with the story, there was no drama, no storm at the front door, no scene of high entreaty. His daughters gathered about the table, listening as rain tracked down the panes and the kettle sighed. There was a hush, and in that hush Camille's face was lit not by shame, but by a practical light. She thought of garden paths, and of roses, of the way a hand could coax matter into order if only it were given the time. She thought of her family's thin curtains, and of the fact that a single rose might carry with it the weight of many small worries made less heavy by one kindness. "Send me," she said quietly. There was no flourish, no demanding of sacrifice. She offered herself as if she were stating a preference for a particular task, like choosing a new broom from a line of brooms. Her father's eyes were full then with something that could almost have been relief. Not because he could free himself of the obligation, but because the choice made allowed him to keep some part of his dignity, his house, his other daughters, the small furniture that remained. He kissed her forehead the way a father might wrap a shawl about a child's shoulders, with a hand that trembled only a little. The road back to the chateau was guided by moonlight and the slow, reflective tread of a father and daughter who understood that their lives had shifted on an unseen axis. They traveled with fewer possessions, with banners of patience instead. The journey was full of small details that would sit in Camille's memory like pressed flowers between pages. The way the cart's lantern swung and made an oval of light on the path. The smell of damp leather and hay mingling with the rose she had carried tucked within a pocket. The soft murmur of insects that seemed to applaud their passing. Antoine received Camille with the same measured tone he had given her father. He showed her the rooms that would belong to her to tend. The scullery with its sink that had once lavished hot water like a small fountain. The linen cupboards stacked and folded in geometries of cloth. The great kitchen where a fire could be coaxed into an imperial orange. Camille listened and asked questions with a careful kindness. How often the lamp oil was changed, how the rolls in the pantry were to be kept fresh, where the broom was stored for the attic. She moved through the house as if it were a body, and she had been taught to treat bodies with respect. There was another there to meet her, a young attendant called Gabriel, who carried the simplicity of youth like a bright coin. He spoke in quick, soft ways, eager to be helpful and gentle with a new hand. He showed her how to navigate the corridors without disturbing the things that lay silent upon their shelves. How to close a window in the way that kept out drafts without slamming oak against oak. How to incline a chair just so that a sitter's weight would not crease its upholstery. Together they began a rhythm that was small and steady. Sweep, dust, tend the fire, refill the lamp, mend what was torn. All the while the house kept its breath, for there was a place in it that breathed differently. The library. It opened not like a cupboard, but like a shore, wide and patient. The door to that room was tall, the wood dark, its handle smooth from the touch of hands for perhaps generations. When Camille first crossed its threshold, she felt as if she had stepped under an arc of very old sky. Shelves rose and rose, as if the walls themselves were made of rows of ordered thought. A ladder leaned in expectation, its runner worn where hands had once balanced upon it years upon years. Ladders, in that light, seemed like quiet bridges, ways to reach something held high and safe. The rooms had names carved into their lintels, names that were more gesture than catalogue. A wing that suggested the music of the stars. A corner that hinted at numbers and the slow bright logic that counts. A niche for poems that read like long soft letters to the heart. These titles offered a sense of the library's character rather than a ledger of its contents. People who had loved thought had visited this place. Imaginings and musings, fragments of old sciences, echoes of experiments in reason and in feeling. Each volume a little island of patient human curiosity. None of it had to be ancient feeling. The books themselves held the hush of long evenings, of lamps left burning while minds turned over their matters. Camille, who knew how to fold a cloth so that it fell like a small and obedient secret, had never handled books of such quiet gravity. She ran her thumb down a spine and felt the give of vellum and leather, the soft ridges where threads held pages together. She opened one at random and let her eyes move slowly, not seeking the next invention or a miracle, but simply to be companioned for a while by another mind. Some passages were brief jottings of thought. Others were the kind of small, unassuming sayings that feel as if they have been left for someone to find on a dull day. One line she read, no author attached, attributed only to a long-ago voice, said something like this: "To be quiet with the world is sometimes to understand it better than by making a great noise about it." The words were more like company than doctrine. An old friend's soft voice saying, "Sit, rest, see the way the light falls." Antoine watched her in those first days with a softness that surprised even him. When they spoke, which they did occasionally by the library fire, their conversation moved like warmed honey, slow, generous, and without need to hurry. He would tell of his own small routines, how he preferred the fire-banked hour between 10 and 11 for reading, when the house gathered itself like a cat, and the light trimmed the pages into gold. He confessed, in a tone that kept nothing of plea, that he had lived much of his life in ways that valued solitude. The attentive solitude of a person who reads and collects, who learns the cadence of his own breath and measures his days by pages turned. He did not ask for admiration. Rather, he seemed to be explaining a state of being. Camille learned, in the same gentle exchange, how small acts could stitch broken things. She scrupulously mended curtains caught on nails, beat rugs of their dust beneath a sky that warmed quickly in the late afternoons, leached water stains from polished tables with patient cloths. She planted tiny rows of herbs in the kitchen yard, and watched as parsley and thyme came up like a small green agreement. The rose bush beside the gate, weak and weathered, was given her particular care. She pruned with the economy of one who knows which stems to save and which to cut away, and over the week it responded with a shy incline toward health. There were moments when the house tested the steadiness of her calm. Visitors came sometimes, traders from the road or folk with the town's sharper manners. At a seasonable fair, she might hear the sound of laughter outside the walls, as bright as coins dropped into a bowl. Sometimes there were gossips who would nudge at the edge of the estate with curious eyes. Once, on the road between the chateau and the nearest village, she encountered a crowd in festive dress. A wedding being carried along with the clatter of shoes and the blooming of paper flowers. She had arranged to be there, tasked with fetching a forgotten tray or to collect some folded linens, and the sight of the revelry made her cheeks rise warm with a private pleasure. Antoine, who had rarely stepped beyond his gates, agreed to attend in her stead when she gently pressed him to attend to the community. Camille wished simply that he might see what it was to be held in the light of others for a little while, to feel the modest warmth of being among people. He did not go for lack of habit at first. He was, by nature, a person of interior measures. Yet when he came, appearing in a step which was careful as a man crossing the tracks of his own life, the crowd did not receive him kindly. They saw only the outline of someone different and drew their faces tight, their smiles thin with suspicion. The mockings were quiet, sharp as thorns, and the color rose from Camille then, not from shame, but from a fierce and honest defense. She stood with the steadiness of one who had tended the estate's bones and the lilies of its garden. She spoke, plainly and with no need to shout, of the kindness she had watched and of the composure that learning could give. It was not a defeat of malice by magic. There were no dramatic reckonings. Rather, there was the soft unravel of a public assumption as people saw, not a beast at all, but a man who had been lonely and who sought a simple thing, the company of a human heart that knew how to be steady. Antoine, who had become used to measuring life by the weight of books and the hours in which lamps were kept lit, found himself altered not by thunder, but by the steady, patient conviction of a woman who would not let him be reduced by the opinions of others. There is a quiet heroism in such refusal. Back at the house, the library became more familiar as the days unrolled. Camille, who had arrived as a willing worker rather than a visitor to wonder, found in the stacks a kind of companionable order. She learned where to find the slim volumes that discussed the motions of stars in patient diagrams, and where the poetry sat, leaning like travelers with their hats on. She learned, too, that books kept comradely secrets, marginal notes in differing handwritings, a pressed leaf or two, a short letter tucked into a fold that spoke of someone's small grief or small delight. Once, she found a note left in a section labeled, softly, Thoughts on the Quiet. It read, in a looping hand, "We are not here to be known by the world. We are here to be willing companions to the world's soft needs." She smiled to herself and pressed the paper back into its place, as one might smooth the crease in a lover's sleeve. A young helper, Gabriel, proved to be a companion in these slow labors. He moved through the rooms as if the house's silence was a map he had promised to obey. He learned quickly from Camille, and she took to showing him the gentleness of careful things, how to oil a hinge without letting the oil run like tears, how to tuck a page into its nearest neighbor so that the next reader would not find a crack of sunlight where a leaf might fall. Together they would light the lamps as dusk softened to the color of worn coins, and sit with the lamplight painting their hands and the pages around them with gold. In the library, the lamp at the table burned with a small, steadfast glow. On some evenings, Antoine would walk through the room and stand for a time looking at a particular shelf, as though he were recalling names of people he had once known. He one day told Camille, in the kindest of confessions, that the house kept fragments of many old thoughts, traces of ways people had once tried to name the stars, ways they had practiced counting the tides, little essays on why a person might plant a garden in a certain way. He called it, softly and with a smile that did not make claims of history, a house that kept the spirit of many patient minds, an assembly of curiosity that echoed, in feeling if not in fact, the sort of reverence one might imagine in far-off libraries whose names had gathered mist. It was a metaphor, he said, not a mortgage of reality. The library did not contain the archives of any single ancient place, but it did harbor the quiet dispositions of inquiry and consolation that older scholars once treasured. Days shaped themselves into a routine as kindly as hands folding cloth. There were mornings when Camille would sweep the long corridor, while the wind moved the curtains like a slow, absent-minded orchestra. Afternoons she would sit beneath the pergola that leaned from the library gardens, reading lines that did not seek to impress but to keep company. Evenings were for tending the hearth, dishing out stew to keepers who had come at odd hours, sweeping ash with an almost ceremonial care, making sure the embers were banked in a way that would keep a slow warmth without consuming everything at once. Her work was not heroic in a spectacle sense. It was heroic in its faithfulness. She did not aim to remake the world in a single day, only to make the world at hand livable, to tend what she could with an honest hand. One night, not long after her arrival, she stood before the library door and paused, feeling a sort of curiosity that was stronger than caution. The house hummed with the privacy of its stored thoughts. The lamp in the vestibule threw a softened oval that made everything blush with the color of warmth. She reached for the handle and felt the familiar smoothness under her fingers. When she pushed open the door a little more, a breath of book dust rose like a small, agreeing cloud, and with it came the scent of rosed tea leaves and something older, paper and binding glue and a faint ink that dried as if in remembrance. Inside, the ladder leaned quietly against the shelves. The ladder's rungs bore the polish of many hands, and when she set her foot upon the first of them, she noticed how precisely the room measured time. Each plank creaked with a soft, considerate sound. Each small movement threw up motes of dust that drifted like a slow snowfall in a housed winter. She climbed, not to seek anything specific, but to be lifted into the span of the room where, from above, one could look out across the pages like a field. From that vantage, the house made itself patient. At the top, in a little alcove that smelled of thyme and leather, she found a slim volume that had been left open as if someone had only just set it down. The words within were not complex. They spoke gently about the manner of living with things that continue long after individuals. How gardens require the humility of being tended beyond one's own life. How books keep the soft work of thought for those willing to bend over them. They suggested, again in that companionable way books often do, that to be in the company of long things, gardens, pages, seasons, was to be held soft against the hard angles of hurried life. As Camille read, the library kept its patient sound. The faint rasp of pages turning from another table, a mouse's tiny negotiation with a corner of carpet, the slow breath of someone asleep in a room upstairs. Beyond the glass of the tall windows, the night pressed its hand to the panes. The rosebush outside drew its lungs in, and a breeze carried a hint of its scent into the room. The house felt like a chest of warm wood closing against a cool evening, and yet there remained, in the shape of the story, a sense that some measures had not yet been taken, duties unaccounted for, debts that needed to be made plain, hearts that had not fully settled into the quiet. Camille's days had found their groove. Her hands learned the faster rules of tidying and mending, and even the rose on the bush near the gate had shown a willingness to survive. But there were still traces in the house that suggested histories not fully told, marginal notes that trailed off into scratches, a portrait whose eyes seemed to follow the reader with a solemnity that could be learned only by time. In the waning light of that evening, with the ladder at her back and the book half closed upon her lap, Camille rose and walked to the window. She watched as the house lanterns burned like patient stars, and beyond them the road that led to her home was a thread of deeper shadow. The world was large around the chateau and small within it. Both sizes could be held together with a few steady hands. The thought of it made her palms feel full in a quiet way, a readiness rather than a triumph. The library, the rose, the ladder, the page. All of them were threads in a tapestry that had only just begun to be woven. Outside, the night breathed, and somewhere near the garden the gentle scrape of a wheel suggested a visitor, or perhaps the return of one who had stepped briefly beyond the gate. Camille smoothed her skirts, and, with a last look at the book, closed the little volume and set it back upon its shelf. She felt the weight of work that would come tomorrow, the tending of the fire, the sweeping of the corridors, the slow coaxing of roses, and also a small, soft anticipation. There were shelves she had yet to cross, pages she had yet to turn. The house kept its hush as she made her way downstairs. The lamplight painted gold upon the step edges. The latter cast a long, patient shadow. In the hush, the library seemed to hold its breath, not in expectation of a miracle, but in quiet welcome of simple attentiveness, of hands that would turn pages slowly and with care. The night outside the windows was not empty, but full of the green noise of trees. The house, for its part, offered the steady promise of work that consoled rather than consumed, of labor that mended both wood and heart in the same patient sweep. This was how the world would keep going for a time. The small labors, the folded linens, the pressing of a rose between the pages of a book as a keepsake. There were chapters yet to be read, and people yet to be fully seen. For now, the story moved like a slow hand over a harp string, gathering tone and warmth, so that when you close your eyes, you might follow its sound across the room and down the corridor, and let your breathing find the same patient rhythm as a page turning in the half-light. The days folded themselves into one another with the soft predictability of a book being read aloud. Morning light arrived at the chateau as if it were reluctant to hurry the story. Dawn came in slow sentences, and the household answered in patient, small chores. Camille rose with the lamps still warm from the night, moved through rooms that knew her steps, and by the time the sun had settled into a steady, gentle brightness, the estate wore the tranquil shape of a place that had found a rhythm. There were mornings when the sky held a pale look of determination, the sort you see before a calm rain decides to fall. On such mornings she would walk first to the kitchen yard and check the herbs. The parsley had a precise, lively green. The thyme, planted in a neat row beneath the west window, sent up new shoots with a readiness that pleased the eye like a small, quiet agreement. She would pinch a few leaves for the soup. The scent would lift and arrange itself around the cooks, who took their pots with a soft seriousness. Gabriel, whose hands grew steadier under her instruction, would stand by with a cloth folded just so, ready to catch the stray splash of broth or the fall of a spoon. The library, meanwhile, remained the house's slow center. Camille found she could lose whole mornings there and arrive at lunchtime feeling as if she had traveled gently to another hemisphere. She began to form routes through the room. A first pass through the wing where the stars were discussed in patient diagrams. A second tour past the volumes that held mathematics and the quiet languages of counting. Then a drift toward poetry, where margins were written in small, looping hands, and where a pressed leaf might lie like a soft punctuation mark. Each path was a way of saying good morning to a different manner of thought. Antoine's presence in the library became less the intrusion of a stranger, and more the quiet of a resident who had learned again how to be noticed. He no longer hovered in a shadow at the doorway. He moved through the racks with the care of someone carrying an instrument, or like one who has learned the names of the panes in a window. At times he would sit for a long while in the high-backed chair by the fire, hands folded, the lamplight softening the line of his face. When they spoke, it was in that slow idiom of people who do not need to perform themselves. He asked about the simplest things, how often the bellows needed airing, whether the library's panes should be wiped before winter, and listened when Camille replied. In those moments the house felt repaired in a way that had nothing to do with new materials. It was the repair of attention. This attention took forms large and small. The binding of books was a particular joy. There was an old bench in a corner of the library where a few neglected volumes lay with their spines softened by time. Camille learned from Gabriel how to tend them, to rub the dust from covers with a dry cloth, to glue a small loose seam with a careful hand, to sew a page that had come free back into an agreeable order. The work was slow and gratifying, and often, as they leaned over a book together, one of them would read aloud a short phrase that had the accidental tenderness of a found thing. They would then set the book aside, its spine newly compliant, its presence in the room affirmed as if by a small act of charity. There were letters, too, tucked behind a flap or left in the hollow of a particular volume. Once, Camille found a stack of correspondences bound with a ribbon so faded it might as well have been sewn into time. She smoothed them open and read in a voice that, though soft, carried the materials of a lived life. Notes about weather, about people who had moved away, about the state of some field or another. One letter spoke of a child's laughter that had once filled an upper corridor. Another mentioned the meeting of two neighbors over a shared pail. The letters were not the kinds of declarations that change the course of history. Rather, they were small keepsakes of a day-to-day civilization, and to read them felt like sharing someone's cup at the table. It pleased Antoine to watch Camille attend to these things. He would sometimes bring down from a higher shelf the slim volumes on natural philosophy, the soft observations on plant behavior, the careful enumerations of the habits of small birds, and hand them to her with the modest pride of one who values a good tool. "There is a patience here," he would say, and his voice would make the words seem like a blessing rather than a lesson. It is a sort of practical kindness. One reads it, and one is less easily startled. Outside the library, the garden responded in its own time. The rosebush by the gate, which Camille had treated with particular care, found a new steadiness. She trimmed only what was necessary, tying branches with soft twine rather than forcing their form. The blooms came tentative at first, then with a sturdiness that looked less like show and more like ordinary health. She pressed a petal now and then between the pages of a small notebook, a private archive of scent for the months when the chill might lean too long on the air. Bees came more readily. The gardeners they hired, the slow, sensible sort who knew which compost to use and when to turn the soil, spoke in approving, practical tones. The estate, which had previously leaned on decorum, began to lean on work done well. The villagers noticed, as villagers do, in increments of conversation. At first their remarks were edged with curiosity. Then, gradually, some of them came to accept the chateau as part of the landscape again. A woman from the market who sold preserved quinces began to leave a jar or two at the kitchen door. A mason who lived near the bridge offered to mend a loose tile. They did not make a festival of it. They simply acknowledged, in the language of small kindness, that a place had been made more habitable through steady labor. Antoine responded to these gestures in the manner of one who had learned the weight of a return. He did not make grand speeches. He sent the mason a pair of gloves with a note that read only, "For hands that keep things standing." It was a modest gift, and yet it spoke of a widening of measure. There were, as the seasons leaned toward the lengthening days of spring, a number of small projects that required attention. The west wing's roof had a slow leak that no one had quite minded before. During a stretch of rain that sat in the sky like a patient animal, they found a patch where droplets had been collecting and making faint, damp halos on the spines of the books below. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden blaze or cry. Instead, the work presented itself as a task of preservation. A beam that needed new shingles, a shelf that required raising a little higher, a careful drying of volumes with soft cloths, and the gentle motion of an unpaid fan. What followed was an unhurried rescue. The local carpenter, who answered to a name that sounded like the creak of a gate, came with ladder and measure and a slow, confident smile. He worked alongside Gabriel and a pair of hired hands, and, under Camille's supervision, they lifted a portion of the roof, spread new timbers, and patched the leak in a fashion that promised a long life. The books were laid out on tables in the great hall, their pages fanned like a series of small, sleepy birds. They were dried with a towel that moved in a rhythm as calm as a metronome. No one moved quickly. No one shouted. There was, for a while, the singular task of keeping paper dry and keeping hands careful, and in that tranquility, a kind of repair was done that had nothing to do with money or with restitution, and everything to do with attention. The villagers came to help without fuss. Some brought sacks of straw to place under the eaves. Others offered loaves and a pot of stew to sustain the workers. It was not a community theater of redemption, but a quiet, practical joining that said more with its presence than any speech could. The carpenter, while hammering in a nail, commented to Gabriel with a smile that passed between them like a shared chord. A house that keeps books is a house that keeps its memories. Gabriel nodded as if he had known this all along. His hands moved with the ease of one who had been given permission to learn. In those days, Antoine's face grew softer more frequently. He would step out of the library into the courtyard, not with the stiff caution of a man in armor, but with the tentative gait of one trying on simpler ways of being. He began to take interest in the small, practical mechanics of the estate, the ways the gutters sang, the proper height of the herb beds, the manner in which a gate could be oiled so that it closed with a considerate hush. He learned names from the gardeners, one called Jean, who had a laugh like a silver bell, a man called Martin whose careful eye kept the hedges neat, and he answered them with a courtesy that had the quiet of someone who was trying to belong. There were moments when old shadows brushed the edges of their days. A painting in the long corridor, one with a face whose eyes had the patient observation of someone who holds a secret in reserve, seemed to regard visitors with a long familiarity. Some shelf corners carried the faint scent of forgotten ink. But these were the kinds of reminders that the past would always be present, not as a judge, but as a companion with an old, slightly wistful instruction to take care where care was still required. When spring warmed into early summer, they decided to hold a small gathering in the garden beneath the pergola. It was not a festival. It was rather a sober, sincere invitation to the village to see how the estate was settling itself into a new pattern. Candles were placed in simple glass jars. Soup was prepared in a large pot, one that had been brought out for the purpose, and bread warmed on an iron plate. Camille arranged small bunches of thyme and lavender in tiny napkins, and Gabriel laid out the chairs so that each seat would catch the candlelight without being in anyone's way. People came with the same matter-of-fact manner that had gradually become their custom. There was an afternoon air of gentle curiosity. A few villagers walked around the garden and admired the rose bushes. Others lingered by the library windows, peering into the warm lamplight as if they were catching the tale of a story. Antoine, for his part, moved among them with an increasing ease. He spoke graciously and kept his comments modest. He listened when the mason told a story about a bridge lock. He laughed quietly when the coiner complained about a stubborn gate. Camille, who had always been the heart of the estate's practical care, took a seat under the pergola and watched. The pergola's lattice was a subtle netting of light and shadow. Vines had been guided along its beams until their leaves lay across the wood like embroidered hands. There was a table with a stack of books, slim, sensible volumes that looked like companions one might leave by one's teacup. People took them up and turned the pages without pretense, reading a short passage aloud now and then. One elderly woman read, in a voice that trembled only a little, a line about the manner of seasons. It was a simple observation, something like, "A garden keeps its promises in the patient way of returning each year," and the listeners accepted it as if it were a small, true thing. It was there, beneath that lattice of leaves and book pages, that the last pieces of reticence dissolved most naturally. There was no sudden unveiling of a curse or a magical reversal. Rather, there was the steady realization, shared without fanfare, that the man who had once been kept apart by his habits was in fact a person whose faults and virtues lay in the same place. The capacity to be alone and the desire, quietly, to be known. He had learned, through Camille's unremarkable fidelity, that company could be a kind of calm cure for a private habit of withdrawing. After that afternoon, Antoine's presence in the village saw a quiet increase. He occasionally accompanied Gabrielle to the market to purchase paper or glue. He declined, with a kind of careful humor, the offer of a brightly trimmed coat one trader thought would suit him, saying instead that a plain one would serve his purpose. To those who remarked on his changed manner, he replied in the softest of voices that he had simply found new ways to be useful. And, in truth, usefulness had a dignity that fit him better than any mask. As the estate settled more, the library continued to be a place that held echoes rather than echoes that demanded answers. Camille discovered a small folio in a low section, labeled with a hand that had been careful about anonymity. On the small arts of everyday living. Inside were short aphorisms and gentle instructions on how to mend a tear without shame, on the best way to wash a kettle, on how to listen when someone speaks without trying to fix them. These notes were not high philosophy. They were instead tiny maps for being human within an ordinary life. Camille copied a few into a small notebook of her own, a private compendium of useful kindnesses, and in the evenings she would sometimes read one aloud to Gabriel while they wiped the table together. There were, as time allowed, invitations that tested the house and its new arrangements. A distant cousin of Antoine's, someone whose manner carried a tone of old entitlement, came to visit, and looked at the polished chairs and the tended hedges with an expression that had the polish of pettiness. He questioned the way the books were arranged, and his voice carried an edge of the old world, a world that evaluated everything in terms of advantage and status. Yet even this small irritation was met with the calm steadiness that had become their way. Camille replied with honest explanations of why certain things were placed as they were. Antoine listened, and the cousin eventually left with his preconceptions intact, but his temper slightly blunted by the quiet dignity he could not match. If there was a moment that might be called a conclusive change, it was not public or grand. It happened one evening when Camille found Antoine sitting in the shadow of the library with a small book open on his knee. The room was dim. A single lamp had been banked lower so that the page glowed and the rest of the room fell away. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment their eyes met with that uncomplicated human recognition, a shared comprehension that they had both been trying to practice new shapes of life. "I have been keeping a small list," he said, and the humor in his voice was a quiet, corrective thing that made the sentence almost laughable in its ordinariness. Things to remember to do. To water the west row of herbs on Tuesdays, to check the roof in the spring, to go to the market sometimes, and not only when I am obliged to. He smiled at how simple the items were. They are not great ambitions. They are just things that keep a place breathing. Camille sat by the table and spoke about her own lists. Notes of repairs, little instructions for Gabriel, a reminder to press a fresh rose for the kitchen book. They compared their lists as if two people might consult the same map. In that small sharing there was the final settling of the household's tone. A life rearranged not by fireworks, but by the steady arranging of bowls, the mending of sleeves, the putting right of hinges. The library, which had always been at the center of these practices, became a place of gentle ritual. They took to reading at certain hours, not as an exhibition, but as a humble recognition that words could keep people company. Antoine read aloud now and then, short, plain passages that spoke of kindness, of the slow work of attention, of small labors that outlasted impatience. People from the village would come in with a question or a request, and would leave with a loaf or a small bundle of herbs. A neighbor's child learned how to feather the edge of a page. A mason learned a new method for securing a sill. These were not efficiencies for the sake of impressing. They were the soft inventions of a community that found itself willing to care for the things that mattered to each other. One evening, late and warm, when the light leaned like honey through the library windows, they sat beneath the pergola with a book and a pot of tea. The rosebush by the gate had produced a bloom that evening, round and unassuming. Camille plucked it gently, set it between the pages of a fresh notebook, and smiled as if she were performing a small rite. Gabriel, who had a habit of asking direct, honest questions, inquired whether the library was truly like the old, distant places his mother had once mentioned, the ones with names that sounded like myths. Antoine considered the question. He chose his words with the same careful candor he had always used. "It is like those places," he said, "in the way that it holds people's attempts at understanding the world. But it is not one of those places. It holds the same spirit, perhaps, as you would find in any room where people have been both curious and kind. If there is any magic here, it is of that small sort, the magic that allows someone to be patient for another person's thought." The rose, pressed between the pages, seemed to agree, as if the scent had become a footnote upon the text of the evening. As summer ripened toward its middle, Antoine and Camille decided to open a few of the library's doors on certain afternoons to any who wished to come and read. They kept the announcement small and quiet. Word of mouth, a notice pinned to the market's simple post. People came with shoes still dusty from their errands and sat beneath the low reading lamps, their presence folding into the quiet without ceremony. A farmer read about stars he had only ever noticed in his field. A widow discovered a short essay about the art of keeping vinegar. A child learned the method for tying a knot that would not slip. These afternoons were not crowded spectacles. They were, instead, small sanctuaries where the village and the chateau met and discovered that their concerns overlapped in the simple register of daily life. Old quarrels were not miraculously resolved. Stubborn habits remained. But where there had been suspicion, there was now a willingness to be instructed or to instruct kindly. There was a mutual use made of the same things: knowledge, bread, a hand to lift a beam, the library, the roses, the ladder, the page. These motifs threaded their way through each encounter like a quiet refrain. In the long evenings that followed, when the lamps had been lowered and the house prepared for sleep, the library often contained the sound of pages turning and the occasional low murmur of conversation. Sometimes, when a storm passed and left the world smelling fresh as if it had been washed, Camille would walk the corridors and gently check the windows, the locks, the shutters. She would return to the library with her hands smelling faintly of lemon and dust, and sit with a small book that required nothing of her but to be present. There were summer nights when the world outside seemed full of a certain contentment. The crickets sang with a sober persistence. The rosebush, having weathered its early trials, offered a steady kind of bloom that did not seek attention. People slept with a certain ease. Within the house there was the simple, unassuming order of mended things and well-made tea. On such nights, the lamp by the reading table was banked, and Antoine and Camille would sit across from one another in a quiet companionship that had earned itself a long and ordinary dignity. As autumn leaned its hand to the world in leaves, took on the modest courage of auburn and gold, they prepared for the slowing season. Camille cleaned the gutters in a careful procession, testing the channels with a practiced eye. Gabriel learned the best way to harvest the last of the thyme. They bound a small collection of essays into a tidy volume, pressing the spine, smoothing the glue, running a thumb along the joint until it settled. It was a book that would not change the arc of history, but it would prove useful on a winter evening. There was, in the cooler air, a sense that the house had grown into its better self. Visible scars remained, worn stone here, an old stain on a table there, but these were like the marks of a life lived rather than the reminders of a life undone. People moved with a new kind of ease. Antoine, once a figure of solitude, could be seen sometimes sharing a joke with a mason, or offering a shy suggestion about the arrangement of chairs at a wedding. He would bring out a small volume and read a line from it to the child who had learned to feather the edges of the pages. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary courtesies that accrue like small coins in a pocket, nearly unnoticed until one realizes one is comfortably wealthy in the currency of human regard. In the evenings that followed, Camille often took to walking the length of the west corridor, her hand resting upon the polished rail as if to measure the solidity of the place. She thought of how the house had opened to her like a slow thing that required tending, and she understood with a quiet pride that she had chosen a life of repair rather than renown. The choice was hers, and had always been hers. It had not been taken. She had not been heroic in the legend-making sense. Her heroism was steadiness, the unglamorous courage to be useful again and again. The library, which had been the axis of this slow transformation, held its final scenes with the modesty of one who knows its purpose. On an evening when the light leaned low and a lantern made the shadows long and homely, they gathered with a small company beneath the pergola. A new volume had been completed earlier that week. They opened it and read a short passage about the usefulness of small daily acts. How a hand that knows the names of tools will find its way in any country. How a person who can fold a shirt neatly will find the strength to fold a life without making it collapse. The words were plain and true, and the listeners received them as such. Afterwards, the guests departed one by one, their steps quiet as if they carried a small new thought home. The chateau settled for the night. The candles in the jars softened. The rosebush breathed in the cool and exhaled the faintest perfume. In the quiet that followed, Camille took the small notebook in which she had kept practical aphorisms and slipped the pressed rose between its last pages. She wrote, with a careful hand, a phrase that felt like an appropriate close. We tend what we can, and what we tend mends. She pressed the pen down and let the ink dry in the lamplight. Then she walked through the library, touching spines as if to thank them. She closed the door softly behind her, and the room, which had kept much and asked for little in return, seemed to breathe a little easier. Before you, who have been resting in this room of imagination, drift wholly into sleep. Let the last images be mild and luminous. Imagine for a final moment the pergola with its vines, the lamp glow mottled across a spread page, the ladder leaning like a thoughtful friend. Picture the rose, pressed, not to preserve it from the world, but to remind someone of a good scent on a dull afternoon. Hear, very gently, the sound of a page being turned. Note how slow and deliberate it is, how it marks the end of a chapter without alarming the next. Let your breathing find its natural rhythm, accompanying the turning of that page. Let the lamplight lessen like a tide drawing away, leaving a strand of amber at the waterline. If this sort of gentle story eases your nights, you might find more such evenings here when you wish them. There will be more rooms to visit, more shelves that keep faithful company. For now, rest within the knowledge that the library keeps its breath, that the roses remember the care they have been given, that small acts carried out with steady hands make a home where once there was only shelter. Let your eyelids fall like a book cover closing on a familiar page. Sleep, as if you were returned to a warm house on a cool night, and let the quiet company of pages and roses and slow lamps keep you until morning.